In this section, we're going to walk through conceptually a typical push cycle. Now, up until this point, we've been talking about deploying code. So we've taken a version-controlled site and we've pushed code to a production site from a development site. We've merged code from a couple of different coworkers working on the same code base, and we've gone through all of the steps to create a release and push it to production. But when it comes to Drupal, the actual push cycle is going to be more complex than that, because we're not just dealing with code, but we are dealing with database changes. And in some cases, our database changes may be more significant than our code changes. So as we work into how to capture the configuration changes that happen in the database into code so we can version control them, it's also important to understand how this factors into the deployment process. While one big reason to version control our code is to be able to roll back changes and to be able to see what changes are between revisions, another big part of the process is making deployment easier and more stable. Now, as we walk through this process, I'll point out what a typical process would be without version control, and then how that's going to change as we apply version control principles to the deployment process. Now, just to be clear, a push cycle is when we take any changes that we've made to our development site and we push it to our production site. We make it live. So the first step in this process is putting our site into maintenance mode if possible. What this does is give people who are trying to access the site a message that says that the site is down temporarily because we're doing some maintenance. And that allows us to stop any changes that are made to the database by our users. So for example, people can't add comments, people can't create new user accounts, anything that would impact the database. So at this point, we know that we can move on to our second step, which is exporting the database. And if something during this deployment process goes a little bit wonky, we can roll back using this export of the database. Next, we want to update our codebase. And if we're on version control, we'll simply use Git Pull to pull the latest release from our master branch. Now, this is one point where using version control really shines. If you're using FTP, at this point, you would need to have kept track of all of the files that have changed and upload those to the remote site. Or you need to upload all of the files to the remote site to make sure you didn't miss anything. With Git Pull, it only pulls down the changes that were made, making it really fast, and also really stable because we know what the changes are that we're pulling in. Okay, so at this point, we have our code base up to date, but in a lot of cases, this is only half of the process. The other part is updating the database. So our next step is to run the update script called update.php. There's a couple ways we can get to it, and we'll go through those steps a little later. We've also done this in previous videos, but what happens during this process is that any .install files that are within a module folder are inspected for update functions. And these update functions might do a number of things. They might actually change the schema of any database tables that are being used by that module. They might adjust some configuration in the variables table. They could do a multitude of other things. But the point is that they make changes to the database and all of it's in code already. So we don't need to do anything special here. We just need to run the update script. It automatically senses what versions or modules are in, and then runs any updates that need to be made to bring up the database to the versions that our modules are now in. At this point, all of the automated stuff would typically be completed. So when we move on to step 5, which is applying any configuration changes, if we hadn't pulled our configuration changes into version control with the features module, what would end up happening is we'd have to manually apply any of these configuration changes. So for example, if we added a field to a content type, we would need to go through the process of adding that field on our production site. If we updated a view, we would need to go into our view and make the updates or import our view to override the existing view. And there's a ton of other possible configuration changes, like variable changes if we want to disable comments for a content type, permission and role changes, menu changes. All of these changes would have to be ones that we would have to mimic on the production site. One, this can be pretty time consuming. If you have 100 different changes that were made in this revision, then going through those steps is going to take a long time. And if your site is in maintenance mode, this means you have some downtime on your site. And secondly, because there's so many manual steps involved, it means that the chances of making a mistake are pretty high. And we might not find out about that mistake until later, after it's done some damage. So when we look at integrating the features module to automate this process of deploying configuration changes, you'll see that updating our features to the latest version is a lot like doing a Git Pull. It's automatic and it's fast. And then our final step is to bring in any content that we've been working on in development that needs to be pushed to production. Now, the state of actually being able to make these importable varies depending on what version of Drupal you're using. In Drupal 6, there are a few options like the feeds module and node export and node import. In Drupal 7, there's a module called UUID features integration, which will allow you to import content like users, nodes, and taxonomy terms. But it's not quite ready to use in production yet. So while we're calling it importable here, this is the best case scenario. In a lot of cases, to bring this content in, you will need to do exactly what you would do with configuration that's not exportable, which is either manually fill out the forms to create the content or automate the process of filling out those forms. So these last two parts, 5 and 6, are the most troublesome when it comes to deploying a release to our production site. Everything else is really straightforward. So in the next videos, what we're going to do is cover the tools that we need in order to automate this as much as possible, reducing the risk of error and also increasing the speed at which we can deploy. So we're going to first look at exportable configuration changes, and we'll tackle these by using the features module. We've talked about this a few times in the previous videos and this one. And then we're going to look at non-exportable configuration. This is anything that can't be exported with the features module or with any compatible module that might expose specific configuration to the features module. And we're going to use a tool called Selenium Ide, which is a Firefox plugin that allows you to record macros in your site and export it into code. So the idea here is that instead of manually running through the process of modifying a view or adding a field to a content type on our production site, we instead play this macro back that plays within our browser to mimic what we would do in that situation. That way we can test the process before we actually deploy it, and we know that all of the right steps are going to be taken. And finally, when it comes to content, we're kind of going to sidestep this in this series and hopefully come back to it in a future video series when the tools needed for doing this are a little bit more mature. But in the future, what we'll end up using is a module called UUID features integration, and this employs the UUID module, which is short for Universal Unique Identifier. And what this module does is create a unique hash, a UUID, for each piece of content. So when it comes to tracking that piece of content, everything has a unique ID that can be referenced the same way. So for example, if I have a piece of content on my local site and a piece of content on my remote site, and they both have the same UUID, then we know that when we make changes locally and add them to our feature module, for example, then when we push them to our production site, they can get pulled in as changes to that piece of content. Now, the reason this is needed is because content doesn't usually have a unique identifier. Nodes have NIDs and users have UIDs, for example, but those UIDs and NIDs can point to different pieces of content or different users on your development site than it does on the production site. And the UUID features integration opens up things like users, nodes, taxonomy terms, all of these things and more to features so they can be version controlled just like any other type of configuration. Let's go ahead and begin by integrating the features module. The features module will allow us to pull the majority of configuration that's important to us into code. And so it's going to have the greatest net effect of improving our deployment process.